So good afternoon, everybody. I know this is toward the end of a busy last 4 days. So on behalf of the International Division, thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Marc, Lewis-DeGrace. I'm Vice Chair of the International Division in charge of conference coordination and events planning. And I just wanted to let everyone know, over the last 2 to 3 conferences, the International Division has tried to have more of a conversation than PowerPoint-heavy presentation, where we talk to practitioners in nonprofits, NGOs, and planning firms that work internationally, just to get an idea of how they work, where they work, how they use planners, and more importantly for this audience, how they employ planning principles. And we have 3 speakers. As you can see, Seki Hirano with Catholic Relief Services is dialing in from Iraq. Hi, Seki.
Hello. Hello.
And to my right, we have Brian English, who's a planner with Global Communities. And we have David Grossman, who's with ICMA. So without further ado, I'd like to have the 3 speakers introduce themselves briefly, just saying more about who they are, what organization they work for, and what role planning plays in that organization. And Seki, I'd like to start with you.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. My name is Seki Hirano. I'm an architect by trade, and currently I am the Senior Technical Advisor for Shelter and Settlement for Catholic Relief Services, our headquarters based in Baltimore. Today I'm dialing in from probably the longest lived city in the world, Erbil, which is in northern Iraq. I think it's been lived in for 6,000 years. It's a privilege to be with you from a far distance. My role in my job at the moment is to support around about 40 countries which Catholic Relief Services are engaged in terms of reconstruction after a disaster or after a conflict. And within that role, I look at the shelters, the housing, the urbanism involved, and the settlement patterns, which maybe we can expand on later. So thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
And Brian, did you want to go?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian English. I'm with an organization called Global Communities. We're a nonprofit organization based out of Washington, D.C. We work for, USAID is our biggest donor, but we work increasingly for other foundations like the Gates Foundation, and now more and more for company foundations. We work in about 27 countries, and the sectors that we work in span from public health to urban planning. We responded to the Ebola crisis. We had been working there before, so that's something that's recently, you may have heard of the organization. After Haiti, we were also sort of first responders and played a role in the long-term development there. Urban planning is a skill set within the organization that we use and deploy on programs where it's appropriate. I think that I'm an urban planner by background, so I've played a role within the organization, sort of championing urban planners, and the role that they can play on various projects. So I'll leave it there. I have much more that I'll say, but I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Okay, my name is David Grossman, and I am the Director of Global Programs at the International City and County Management Association. And excuse me if I'm a little hoarse. I've just spent almost 3 weeks in China, and pollution got to me as well as several others, so we're all dealing with one of the hazards of urbanization, rapid, unplanned urbanization in sort of a developing country. China's not really a developing country anymore. But I have a master's degree in international affairs. I come from the international development side from Columbia University, but while I was there, I took a whole course of study in the School of Urban Planning. So I'm not a planner per se, but you know, I'm close to the profession. And I went to work for the U.S. Agency for International Development as a Foreign Service officer. I worked in Honduras and in Costa Rica, and had a full career at USAID, where I kind of grew up and focused on urban programs. They, back in the day, had an Office of Urban Programs. It sort of morphed into the Office of Urban and Environmental Programs. And there is still a small urban group within the agency. I then went to work for ICMA in 2008, running their international consulting group. In the last couple of years, we've merged our U.S. domestic consulting with our international consulting, because we recognize that the issues are really similar issues. You know, we're working in different contexts, cultures, and scales and levels of sophistication, but the expertise is cross-cutting, and I hope that's a point that you'll take home, that your skill set is very much in demand globally. And when I was at USAID, those, you know, the federal programs, our foreign assistance program, recognize the skill set of city managers and the relevance of the city manager to the execution of our foreign aid programs. So ICMA was awarded its first large international development contracts in 1989. So although the organization was founded in 1914, always with a global perspective, we didn't get actively engaged with boots on the ground in, you know, 25. We've worked in over 50 countries since then. We are kind of more focused on local government matters, but as you know, within local government, there's such a wide array of activities, the complexities of running a city. So we address all aspects, and of late, and I'll mention just a few projects later on in the discussion, we are really focused on land use management to a large degree, with cities growing spatially as well as demographically, and with the issues of climate vulnerabilities. It's really an important foundational element in all of our projects.
Thank you all. So David and Brian, if I could just ask you to kind of dig a little deeper about the work you guys have both done with USAID, talking specifically about what their traditional approach to international, well, to urban development has been, and also touching on how has that changed over the last several years?
You want me to go first? You're gracious. You obviously have more experience, David. But I have been doing this since 2003, so for a while now. And when I moved to DC and started doing international development work, USAID's sort of championship of urban development was sort of coming to an end of its heyday, which I'll let David talk about. So USAID doesn't necessarily have a specific focus on urban. It's not one of their main 7 development objectives, but it's sort of a cross-cutting thing that, you know, the world is obviously urbanizing. So if you're dealing with public health, you're more likely to be dealing with it in urban areas or whatever the issue is. So, you know, my view and my experience in watching the urban agenda within USAID is mixed. As an organization, as a professional, I try and play a voice and a role in advocating that it is included in the development agenda, because it's important. And when I go to the United Nations World Urban Forums every couple of years, and you see how well articulated urban strategies are from GIZ and the Germans or any other country, it's embarrassing sometimes that USAID does not have an articulated urban strategy. So as you know, as a practitioner, as an organization, we're constantly advocating that it is included, and then we're always working on creative ways to get the discipline and get the focus on urban areas included in programs. So maybe that's my perspective, and David, you could share yours.
Yeah, I mean, back in the day, USAID and other donors had pretty robust programs focused on the urban poor and affordable housing and slum upgrading. I don't know if any of you attended the previous presentation, but there was a fellow from UN Habitat who said back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there was real focus on slum upgrading and on the urban poor. That approach broadened over the years to be much more comprehensive and finding its way to local government itself and looking at sort of whole of the city approaches, incorporating the urban poor and adopting an inclusive approach to the most vulnerable residents of the city. ICMA, like Global Communities and many other NGOs, advocates the urban agenda and the importance of it, and I think we're all kind of well positioned now because, as you've all heard probably for a long time, how the world is urbanizing, and it's like all roads are starting to lead to local government and a recognition of the complexities of city management and addressing all residents of the cities. And again, planning for growth. ICMA is primarily focused on secondary cities now because that's where we feel we can have the most impact. That's where planning can get ahead of the curve as these cities are growing out. The mega cities are sort of built out. There are all kinds of programs that can take place, brownfields programs for, but I think where we'll have most impact is in secondary cities. And in terms of USAID, it's hard to turn the big ship around, and they've always had a focus on integrated rural development, thinking that focusing on the poor would raise GDP. Those strategies have not worked over the years, and the agency is embarking on a new program. It's called the Cities Development Initiative in the Philippines, actually, and ICMA has the great privilege of implementing this new project. We're working in 12 cities, secondary cities in the Philippines, and the idea is that investment in cities will ultimately raise national GDP, whereas the focus on integrated rural development did not. But it's not just a focus on the cities, it's a focus on the cities and their regional economies. So it's really incorporating the peri-urban and rural areas, the agricultural areas, looking at value chains and viewing the city as an economic hub. The idea in the Philippines is to diversify the economy and make it more resilient out of the Metro Manila area and into secondary cities. And land use planning is a major aspect of our work in all the cities. Asset management and focus on land is a major portion of our work in the Philippines.
Thank you. And one item that we had kind of talked about while we were planning this is in kind of the void that USAID has left, that there's been considerable investment and involvement by foundations, by philanthropic organizations. Can you two kind of touch on your experience with that and what some foundations, what their priorities are and how they may be different from USAID or any other bilateral or multilateral lenders?
Yeah, sure. As USAID's sort of direct funding for this has sort of more this cross-sectoral integrated element, and as we look for other funding to support cities, we have been more successful in finding that support from foundations. And even that, there's been some bright spots. So, 8 years ago, the Gates Foundation wanted to see what type of impact they could make in urban poverty reduction and urban space, and they spent, for them it was a rounding error, but it was $100 billion of investment in cities, and so that was a really hopeful time for many organizations that were partnering with the Gates Foundation and doing that. But then they also sort of wrapped the urban focus into the other sectors that they're working in. So they don't have a discrete urban sort of focus now. But then even Rockefeller Foundation and the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative, that again was wonderful to watch Judith Rodin come take the presidency of the Rockefeller and put that as the sort of key program that will be the sort of mark her tenure in the organization. You know, and then there's other smaller, you know, less publicized opportunities that we work on. So mining companies, for example, you know, they have a significant footprint in an area and they have a significant amount of money to work with, and they need support to, you know, help the really rapid population growth that will happen around a mining territory. So we've worked with some of these in Congo, for example, in Colombia. And then companies, we hear a lot about the amount of financial flows from private sector companies is, you know, far exceeds what USAID and bilateral spending or donor spending is. And I'm seeing that more and more as we end up working with more companies like Caterpillar Foundation or John Deere Foundation, MasterCard Foundation, others. So there's been, you know, I'm encouraged to see that we're able to channel some of those funds towards the urban development needs.
ICMA has worked with foundations primarily domestically here in the U.S. in sort of niche areas on aging and depressed communities and networking depressed communities. Not on libraries. Gates Foundation gave us a big grant to work with libraries and local government, but not so much internationally. However, with the newfound interest of many foundations and newly formed foundations focused on urban development and cities, we're just devising. In fact, we hired a company, an outside company, to help us develop a foundation strategy to look at, you know, what does ICMA really bring to the table that foundations would be interested in funding. And so we're embarking on this strategy, but some of our niche areas are city-to-city peer networking. You know, like APA, ICMA is a professional association. We're all about networking. We're a platform for partnering cities across the globe, creating global networks of cities, and this is a compelling, the peer-to-peer. And this is why I encourage you to get into this, because this is an important trending topic. You all can bring something to the game, and the foundations recognize that. Another area is healthy cities. I'm sure you're all aware that in the U.S. there's a new approach on sort of whole of government, whole of local government, looking at all programs through a health lens. It's not just your health department that's worried about health. It really has to be you planners who are looking at the physical design of things, transportation, parks, with a health lens, bike lanes, street, you know all this. So we are, that's compelling, and we hope to bring all of that to the international arena, which again bodes well for, you know, your skill set fitting into you know, what we're trying to do and what we think foundations will find attractive. So.
Thanks. And Seki, thank you for your patience. One thing that I wanted to talk to you about, Catholic Relief Services traditionally has worked in the disaster response and recovery world. And as you were mentioning, the countries that you're working in are countries that are post-disaster and post-conflict countries. And one of the things I wanted you to touch on is how over the last 10 or so years, I know Catholic Relief Services has been responding to a lot more disasters in urban areas. And also, over the last several years, I think you guys have started working proactively with some communities where it's not just coming in after the disaster happened, but trying to work proactively with those communities to harden their infrastructure and their communities against future disasters. Can you touch on those 2 points? Oh.
Hello, yes. Hello. Yes, yeah, completely right that we are coming from the humanitarian side. We are coming, that's our entry point. After a disaster, after or during or after conflict, we try to support with life-saving support. And I guess like Haiti, 2010, was the big urban disaster where all the humanitarian organizations got a lot of experience through. And ever since, there has been a multitude of disasters which affected the urban areas, from the Philippines to Mali to Vietnam, etc. And what we are consciously doing in Catholic Relief Services is that we want to get better at responding to the urban needs specific to that country or specific to that city. As you probably know, traditionally, NGOs or humanitarians have been rural actors. And when we act or when we have to respond within an urban context, all the complexity really challenges us. Our systems are not in place to deal with all the networks that exist in urban. So we have had the experience through Haiti. I think maybe we might touch upon that, and I think as a community of humanitarians, we are all trying to gain more and more experience. Like, for example, in Tacloban, there was the Typhoon Haiyan, the largest, the strongest typhoon that made landfall. And within an affected city such as Tacloban, there was really, when you talk about emergency relief and when you talk about being effective in an urban context, we didn't have that knowledge of what to do. And it took us a long time. It took us actually a year and a half to really understand what the population needed in terms of housing, what the politics were, what the zoning, the hazard zones were, and what the options might be for reconstruction or relocation. And of course, reconstruction is a process. So coming out of that experience, what we said is that if we start to respond after an disaster, it's too late. We need to get to know the system, the people, and we need to be familiar with that context before something happens. So we've been making a few efforts worldwide to identify vulnerable cities, such as Bamako in Mali, of flooding, in cities in Vietnam, to really start to get to know the system, to start disaster reduction with communities, project planning, before something happens. And hopefully that will get us prepared to be able to respond, as well as to help the recovery quicker in the future. And I'm currently in Iraq, and I just visited, I don't know if you know, a city called Kirkuk, which was an ISIS-held area, and it's been kind of liberated in the last year or so. And we're starting to say, okay, like these displaced people are staying there temporarily until they can return home. Okay, so what are those politics within that city, and where they are living, and how they are going to spend their time until they return is a geopolitical, actually an urban planning issue, and all the planning and zoning that one does in a city is very evident in a highly politicized environment such as Iraq.
Oh, sure.
I just had a thought as Seki was speaking, and it was really music to my ears to listen to him, because I think previously and historically, harking back to the old days, NGOs, would go into a country, they'd kind of do their thing. They're invaluable. Often they worked absent any other resources, make an incredible and important contribution. But for sustainability, did not engage with local governments. Now, true, especially decades ago, local governments were weak, they were corrupt, just like they were in this country back at the turn of the century. Nevertheless, we cannot give up on them, and everything that ICMA does is about capacity building across local governments, learning by doing, doing exchanges, city-to-city networking, creating and nurturing and strengthening municipal associations. We work hand in hand with municipal associations to share information, local municipal associations. We have 40 affiliated associations around the world to scale up and share information. So I appreciate listening to Seki that they're working with the local government. And I think for sustainability issues, which probably any of you who've worked with cities can appreciate, local government really should be the convener. They should be bringing all of civil society together. It's all about citizen engagement and understanding the expectations of citizens and delivering with local services. So I'm really pleased to see that a big global NGO like CRS is recognizing this.
Yeah, I'd just add one point to that too, and in agreeing with what both David and Seki are saying, is that we see ourselves as sort of filling the convergence gap, if it will, between if it was just left to the government or if it was just left to the community. To bridge that gap is difficult, just if you just leave it to one entity or another. So we often find that, you know, the reason that we are there to begin with is that a service isn't being provided, that a way hasn't been figured out how to deliver water or housing or whatever the issue is that you're addressing. So to bring parties together to earn trust and support with local governments, and the same with the communities, and bring people around the table and, you know, figure out the solutions, that is the path towards sustainability. And I think that's the unique role that organizations like ours can play.
And we call it the demand side and the supply side. Right. And we have to bridge demand and supply, and NGOs help organize civil society, recognize, help prioritize, but in the end, you know, there has to be a meeting of the minds and a convening.
And to kind of follow up on that, for the three of you, one thing that I think as American planners, I think kind of the planning ethos in the U.S., if you look at the Philippines or Iraq or any of the other countries, they have their own architects, they have their own civil engineers, so they have that technical knowledge. But I think one of the things that we bring, and you guys have touched on this in different circumstances, is kind of, I think, the two pillars of American planning, or the American ethos of planning, is a holistic, comprehensive approach to planning where you try and bring everybody together, like you were saying, Brian, and also touching on being inclusive of the general public and especially vulnerable communities. And if you could kind of touch on instances where you've worked actively to bring in those vulnerable communities, or to take that holistic approach if, say, the municipality was just interested in housing or water or resiliency, but how you bring a holistic look to all of those situations.
I'm happy to go.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that is right. I think that, you know, oftentimes a solution isn't able to be developed because the norm that exists there hasn't been addressed yet, or hasn't been challenged, and the conversation, no one's helped them push the conversation into that realm where that hasn't been explored. I'll give you one real quick example. In India, when we were working there, the census covers the formal environment, but not the slum environment, and they weren't able to plan, the city wasn't able to plan at a comprehensive citywide level around what slums needed because they didn't have data. So it's just sort of, in the shadows, the sort of this data gap. And so we worked with them to fill this gap by mobilizing volunteers from the community to collect basically do a mini census. And so we asked one person to interview 25 of their neighbors, and we created these little clusters. And then we were able to get all of this data that we needed for over 350,000 households. We aggregated that into a GIS database, and we could help the city for the first time see that comprehensive data on what's water access across slums in the city of Pune. But then the inclusive element of this is what we did then next was we took these sort of summary statistics at the cluster level, gave it back to the volunteers who collected the data, and taught them how to do what we called micro-planning, which is neighborhood planning or block planning, and said, look, these are the problems that you've identified at, across these 50, 100 households, and just get them talking about it. And then you can start doing community action planning where you say, okay, well, what resources do we have to address this, and start to mobilize. That's the sort of civic engagement, civic participation, it's sort of animating process. And that's like what David's saying, the sort of demand and supply side, sort of looking at these, what government can do to supply water, for example, and where is the demand from the neighborhoods to say that, look, we only have one water tap per 25 households. So that's just one example that sort of gets at that.
Yeah, as Marc said, in many countries there is professional capacity. It's mixed, obviously, and I just noted that this month, May 17th through 19th, the Belize Association of Planners, in conjunction with the University of West Indies, is having a Caribbean Urban Forum. It's a meeting much like this one, but at the Caribbean planners, and some of our staff from the Dominican Republic and from the Municipal Association in the Dominican Republic will be attending that, and my staff is asking if APA knows about this, to kind of make that connection. So there is capacity, but it's mixed, and even when there is capacity, like in the Philippines where people are really highly educated, there's a lack of systems, and there are competing databases from federal government and local government and different ministries, and there are holes in the cadastre, so you can't rely on the data. There's a lot of interference of politics, and local elections hold things up. Some of the planning departments are quite politicized and kind of change as the mayors change. Political will is a challenge in many cities to really engage with citizens. And I think there is a lack of the key knowledge of the subject matter, the knowledge you need for decision making, and that's where, particularly with land use planning, with climate adaptation, you have to bring in the science. And we almost always bring in scientists, and we almost always partner with local universities, and we try to introduce planning tools, for coastal zone planning, GIS systems, the various tools that you guys work with every day. And then there's a lack of this, as I said before, the whole of government coordination. Planning is not connected to the other departments, so the plans aren't, for example, turned into ordinances, and they're not institutionalized. They kind of sit on the shelf. And our methodology is to just learn by doing, taking the plunge, learning the whole project cycle from design to procurement to execution and monitoring and evaluation, and really focusing on the sustainability of local institutions so that you're making a lasting impact.
And Seki, I wanted to see if you could talk about, so as you mentioned, you're dealing with Iraq, and there are a lot of ethnic, religious challenges in the cities that you're working, not just in Iraq, but around the world. And a lot of times when you respond to a disaster, the local municipality may be decimated. There may not be that that capacity for someone to say, okay, this is how we're going to move forward, and you have thousands, tens of thousands of people making a bunch of individual decisions. So as a humanitarian, as a relief organization, in the urban environment that's very dense, how have you guys tried to kind of navigate that and try to bring people together for collective good?
Sure. This is the challenge. Of course, like we stand up, or we our mandate is to stand up for the most vulnerable population, whoever they are, whatever religion they are. However, when we do enter a highly politicized context, we have to play by the laws of the land, whoever that is. Today I was having a conversation about, okay, which part of the city of Kirkuk should we be targeting for a housing upgrade project? The city is divided into many parts of ethnicities, Turkish, Kurds, etc., type of thing, and of course we are within the system. Okay, like we have to work with the authorities, with the communities, and they have their opinions. At the same time, we have to keep with our mandate to say our criteria is for the most vulnerable. Yeah, and we have a lot of negotiations that happen to derive at the right targeting. Even if we look at it beyond the city, like we're saying, okay, like in the north, we will support this community. In the south, we will support this community. So we don't as well get associated with the politics. We try to be neutral. And of course, we can never be neutral. Humanitarian aid is part of the context, is part of the conflict. It becomes part of the solution, as well as, yeah, it could become part of the tension if you don't take care of it. So I think we have this in every context. We cannot, I think, like last time we were counting, like humanitarian aid or international humanitarian aid counts for about 10% of the needs within the shelter recovery process, and the rest is done by the people themselves. And how to choose that 10% becomes a big issue, and again, yeah, we just have to work with the system. The other thing to note is that we always kind of work in this resource scarce environment. There's not enough funds, there's not enough resources, not enough capacity to do everything that people need. Also, you mentioned, I think Brian and David mentions about the weak governance of the places that we work in. So then we try to support the communities and to strengthen their voice, and try to release their capital, try to release their potential to support themselves through specific interventions, knowing that we can't do 100% of everything. And I guess that is a challenge that we always face. How do you mobilize the community? How do we make their recovery, how do we trigger their recovery, their self-recovery, in a way?
And as a follow-up to that, one thing, I'm just thinking in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, or the New York region post-Sandy, you have this push to do something so it doesn't happen again. And the question is, 5, 10, 15 years from now, will there still be that impetus, or will people have forgotten? And I know a lot of projects that Catholic Relief Services works on, you may only have a mandate of a year or two to do as much as you can, and then you have limited resources, so then you have to go into the next disaster. So can you just kind of talk more about what you do?
For sure.
Sure.
For sure. So time and time again, we respond to disasters and we say, okay, could this have been prevented? And when we do enter an area, we're saying, can those houses have been built safer? Are there any techniques that are affordable that could have been put in place to minimize that risk? So we call that Build Back Safer, and that is very much ingrained in our sector's work, to say that whenever we can support the Build Back Better, we should be doing that to minimize the damage and the effect for the next disaster. I think, Marc, you touch upon a really pertinent point. how sustainable is that? Like at 15 years' time or in a generation's time, would that have been forgotten if it's a once in a 50-year cycle typhoon or earthquake, like the Asian tsunami, etc.? Would that knowledge or that alertness have been forgotten? I think maybe, yeah, Brian and David as well take part in a lot of disaster risk reduction projects or community resilience projects, where all of this evacuation routes, preparedness, urban design, zoning, all comes into place. And I feel maybe a lot more should be done in that area. There is a conference in Cancun this month coming to talk about disaster risk reduction at the UN, and I think there is a lot more to be done within those kind of realms of resilient cities, or even resilient villages.
And David and Brian, can you kind of talk about the challenges you guys face with making things sustainable beyond 1 to 5 years, making sure the ball keeps rolling forward?
Yeah, well, again, for ICMA, the focus in this country and globally is on local government, and local government's going to be there for the duration, so it's all about, capacity building. So I'll just give 3 quick examples of some of our projects. One is planning for climate adaptation in the Dominican Republic. So this is, about resilience. It's about preparedness. ICMA has done a lot of disaster response, and we can talk about that in Haiti and Hurricane Mitch and the 2004 Asia tsunami. I mean, we're there restoring, basic services from local government, but really, most of our work is focused on resilience and preparedness. So in the DR, we're promoting participatory land use planning processes to reduce vulnerabilities and increase resilience at the municipal level. So our technical approaches are, capacity building of and partnership with local institutions, including, as I mentioned earlier, the Municipal Association for the Continuity. There's training of municipal personnel and community organizations in participatory planning and adaptation techniques. We're engaging community-based organizations in communicating the impacts of climate change to vulnerable populations, and we're doing this with small grants and a communications campaign. And we employ, in all of our projects, city-to-city partnerships, either from the US or in Indonesia, which is my next example, from Australia, where there's an affinity and more of a natural partnership. And we bring on resource organizations. There's a group based at Columbia University. It's called UCERN. It's a global network of universities. They have people all over the world focused on climate adaptation. So we bring in the science, and we, make sure that there are tools and systems there that people know how to use going forward. In Indonesia, we're developing recommendations for a coastal management plan that addresses erosion resulting from climate change. And we've introduced a coastal modeling tool, and we build the capacity of the city employees to manage it, along with a group from the university. And this is Samarang in Indonesia and the Gold Coast in Australia. And the Australians are sort of, coaching them on how to use this tool and using it appropriately for their issues. Last, as I mentioned earlier, in the Philippines, it's a very broad based program on economic development and resilience, but we're trying to improve local capacity and inclusive and resilient urban development, promoting low-emission local development strategies, expanding economic connectivity and access between urban and rural areas, as I mentioned earlier, and strengthening multi-sectoral capacity to ensure inclusive growth. So the technical approach here is on local government asset management, maximizing land use, working in pilot cities. It's resource scarce environment always, so you pick your pilots. You hope the municipal associations and the national government will pick up on successes and promote them. We're doing training, we're providing toolkits, we're community outreach always, tailored individual mentoring to professionals in the country, results measurement tools, performance measurement, crucial across the board, you all know this. Coalition building with NGOs, academia, government, and other international donors, and central level policy development using our own experts, but also academic authorities, and land and governance coalition advocacy. So we impact national policy from the local level. You know, local government and municipal associations are like a sounding board for what national policies are working and not working at the local level. That's the importance of municipal associations and, you know, one aspect. So these are just some different objectives and technical approaches we have, but it's getting ahead of the curve, you know, building resilience and planning for vulnerable cities.
So what I'll add in terms of sustainability, that what hasn't been said already, because I agree with everything that Seki and David are saying. There's many ways you can look at sustainability, but I think one of the more exciting ways and exciting approaches that I've taken is looking at market-based solutions. And that's, you know, when you look at the toolkit of things you can do, institution building, you know, whether it's within the local government or within a neighborhood association is, you know, one sort of role. And then looking at how does what market forces can you use? How do you look at the revenue to make things happen? And this is part of what we do in local government anyways, is, you know, how we're going to collect the taxes to pay for this. But I'll give one example. In India, again, in the city of Bangalore, we were looking at how recycling was happening, and it was happening sort of, it's almost entirely by the informal sector. And when it's left, again, in the informal sector, you can't address occupational health and hazards, and you can't get economies of scale because, you know, you're sort of leaving it relegated to back alleys and, you know, sort of it doesn't have proper space. So we, over a very long time, over a 7-year period, we started getting the city to give us land that we could start constructing formal recycling centers. We used money from foundations to pay for the construction and really pilot how a proper recycling center could operate. And then we started engaging the informal sector in this space so that they could have, you know, drinking water and things like that. They didn't have to be doing it, you know, in these unsafe, unhygienic conditions. And then really looking at how does the revenue model work? What are the, you know, how much waste do you need to bring in to collect X amount of dollars to pay for people's salaries? And over a long period, we gradually piloted this more and more and became more and more successful in scaling it up. And then a misfortunate fortune happened where there was a protest at one of the garbage dumps, and the village in the outskirts of town said, you know, we're sick of being polluted by all this garbage being dumped here unscientifically. And so they blocked the roads, and the waste started to back up in the city's neighborhoods. And all of a sudden it was this like crisis of consciousness. Everyone was saying, well, wait a sec, why isn't the garbage that I dumped on the corner just disappearing like it always does? And so, you know, moms were taking to Facebook, and it became this televised conversation. And, you know, fortunately, we had been piloting these little recycling centers. We had done 7 at that point. So everyone needed a solution. So all of a sudden, these recycling centers, the government said, oh, you know, we've got to do now one of these for every ward, 198 wards in the city. So it just took off. So, and the whole model is based on really looking at the sort of market mechanics of sort of unlocking the value of what would go to a landfill and recycling it and using that money to help pay for its cleanup. It's obviously, you know, waste management can't sustain itself on its own, just recycling, but it certainly plays a very important role in sustaining and scaling up that activity.
And one thing that I wanted to kind of get an impression from everybody, and for David and Brian, domestically in the U.S. context, with AID's future potentially being up in the air, still a lot of unknowns, and how you work with your partners to try and make sure that things can happen even maybe in an environment where there's not that federal money? And also for Seki, for Catholic Relief Services, since I believe most of your funding comes from small donors. So throughout the economic cycle, I'm thinking the Great Recession, how did you guys respond to a decrease in revenue, and how have you guys thought about looking forward to ups and downs in the market and with donor funding? So whoever wants to jump in first.
I don't know if I have a brilliant answer to this in any way, but we are continuing to make sure that our funding is as diverse as possible, so that we don't, whatever USAID and the budget situation for the federal government looks like in the future, that we're, protecting ourselves against budget cuts. So that's one way that we're approaching this, is diversify, and look at non-traditional and, people that we wouldn't typically work with, even some of the tech companies. How can we work together in, citizen engagement and things like that? I think that's one response. The other I would say is that I do feel encouraged by the new urban agenda that the UN passed in Quito last year, and the fact that the Sustainable Development Goals have goal number 11 on cities. Mm-hmm. I think that the advocacy that that organizations like ours and the sector has played in making sure that cities were there on the agenda was awesome to watch, and it really paid off. So I feel encouraged by some of the larger international agenda setting, and the fact that, this is the way the world is going, and sort of whether you want to ignore it or not. And so, I think that's where I guess I feel a little hopeful.
Yeah, I have to say I also feel hopeful. I mean, as you all know, there was major pushback from Congress, and the slimmed down budget, so it just didn't go anywhere, and USAID is actually funded at higher levels than last year, at least for the remainder of this year. So, and there was language in the bill that said any proposed reorganization of USAID or the State Department has to come back to Congress for approval. So they're watching closely, and there's a lot of pushback, not only from foundations and private sector, but I mean, there are checks and balances in our government, and our officials understand the importance of all these issues. Now, I also want to say that the EU is really, the European Union is really picking up the banner on this one, and ICMA was invited to participate in an EU-funded project, and our role will be to be on an advisory board focused on the U.S., on climate adaptation, and to select U.S. cities who will participate in exchanges with European cities around climate adaptation and best practices. And so the EU is actually funding U.S. cities to go to Europe and to host Europeans and others to, continue the agenda. So, for example, ICMA is now registering in Europe as ICMA Europe, so that we are eligible to bid on EU-funded projects. We've always partnered with our European colleagues for these, but now we can, really be out there and prime them. So that's just one of several of our strategies for diversifying our funders, and not just following the money, but really, following the people who are trying to do the right thing and have the right agenda, or at least that's in sync with, with our mission.
And Seki, did you want to touch on the financial challenges with Catholic Relief Services?
Sure. So we access the U.S. the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, OFDA funds of the USAID branch. And yes, as you mentioned, it has its up and downs. And when a big crisis hits, the support to a specific country either mushrooms or doesn't materialize, but then the needs are still there. So we are lucky enough to be able to access private donations, which gets us going. The other way that we do if it doesn't materialize from those big donors, is that we work very closely with our Caritas partners, which is an umbrella organization, Caritas Internationalis. There is a Caritas in a lot of the countries, and they either fundraise, we work together, they fund us, we fund them, depending on who is responding to which, to each country. The other way, as David and Brian were saying, like diversifying, we on the ground, we are very conscious that the humanitarian sector is very isolated in terms of there's a lot of other actors out there who are contributing to humanitarian assistance, like the private sector, and what we're trying to do is to make more links with them and to work together with them, so we have more coordination with the private sector and civil society, together with the international community. So there is, I would say that there isn't, a golden rule for us. When the needs happen, like we're privileged enough to be able to mobilize the private funds immediately, and then we go on from there.
Okay, thank you. And I think we have probably another 15 minutes. So if anyone has questions, if you want to just start lining up from the microphone, we'll get to as many as we can.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the panel. It's really good to hear these different views from some of the different agencies. By way of full disclosure, before I left the field of architecture for urban planning and urban design, which is what I do now, I spent 2 years in the Peace Corps, and I came across many of the different agencies, 2 years Peace Corps, Lesotho, and Southern Africa. And one of the things I find striking about the conversation is though I know it's not intentional, there still seems to be a little bit of a mismatch with understanding what the resources that are coming from industrialized nations versus the scale of the problems that are being addressed. And that there's often this misunderstanding that even $100 million is a tiny fraction of a GDP of even the tiniest countries that are very, very poor. So the question I have is what have you learned about best practices and techniques of urban planning that can be scaled up and transferred over to your local partners? And which strategies are replicable, which strategies can easily be transmitted to other stakeholders and other cities within the same countries, and what has been your experience in trying to hand over the kinds of things that you're doing to local stakeholders so that you no longer have to be the one guiding it?
You want to take a few questions at a time?
Let's answer them briefly.
Or it might be good to take.
Okay, we can do that.
I think we go faster that way.
Okay.
Get through more.
Okay, it's kind of similar along same lines, but so anthropologist Marc Schuler published the book Killing with Kindness in 2012, and he talked about the role of NGOs, specifically in Haiti, and called it and was arguing for a form of trickle-down imperialism, and really critiqued the way that power works within aid organizations, right, and how it imposes mandates down the chain, very top-down approach. So my question is, what are organizations such as ICMA or USAID doing specifically, and I know you spoke a little bit about it when you're presenting, to include community members at the decision table? Because a lot of times they're left out of the decision table, right? We have experts that have studied these things, but it's community members that also know their community best. So I'm wondering what they're doing, and then also apart from just the resiliency strategies that you talked about.
The what strategies?
The resiliency strategies. Thank you.
Sir,
Take one more.
please.
You going to respond, or?
We'll answer. We were just going to take a couple questions and then.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. My name is Victor Vallejo, and I was a UN volunteer in 1980 in Botswana. I didn't finish the whole 2-year terms. And then I ended up working for the city of Los Angeles in the city planning department, and I've been there since then, and I'm about to retire at the end of the month. now I'm looking at moving to Madrid, and at the same time, I'm looking at what was my dream for at least 5 years, to work in an international organization in developing countries involving urban planning and everything. So what struck me is I came to know about the sweeping away of squatter settlements that have been in Manila for about, I don't know, 15 or 20 years, and the dire consequences of where they live and what that means for them, and perhaps that they'll be displaced and just moving the people who live in those squatter areas to somewhere else in Manila. And as opposed to, my parents are from Ecuador, and I've been in Guayaquil, and one of the squatter areas there has, I think, benefited from the World Bank project of lots and sites and services, right. And so the streets were paved, there was landscaping, there was lights on the streets, the homes were no longer made out of wood, they were concrete block, etc. And I don't think that these people that live there, their income is any better. I don't really know. But it was a contrast. And I'm thinking, okay, where do the NGOs, how do they get involved in something so horrific of what's happening in Manila? And in that particular sense of politics of clearing out these slums in such a rough manner, I don't know, just address that.
I'll like to jump into question number 2, which was the phrase used was trickle-down imperialism and coming from the top down and from Western culture into other cultures and imposing values. And I mean, I'm putting words in your mouth, and I'm assuming this is where you're coming from. So I think all of us, I think I could speak for all of us, particularly ICMA, even in this country where it's all about citizen engagement from the very first thing. We have a trademarked approach to our work. It's called City Links, and it's partnering city to city. But before we do a partnership, ICMA staff and maybe some ICMA expert pro bono members will visit the city in the developing or transitioning country, understand what they want to do, where they're coming from, understand if the political will, but also the engagement of civil society in this agenda. And once we understand that agenda, then, only then will we find partners who can contribute to that agenda. You know, a city in the US or elsewhere that will have that similar experience and mission and agenda. So really it's all about citizen engagement. We have a very robust public safety and violence prevention portfolio in Mexico and Central America, addressing gangs and youth, and basically what we're doing is promoting community policing, establishing community violence prevention committees that are really made up of all civil society, connecting them to local government, bringing in the cops, you know, the police. We're doing city-to-city partnering with Spanish-speaking cities in the U.S. and in California and Texas and Florida to really look at community policing and involving the community and engaging local partners from the get-go. As I said earlier, we engage immediately with our affiliates who are the local municipal associations to help to understand, you know, the lay of the land and to find local experts. So that's how we roll.
Maybe I'll address this first one since you addressed the second one. On the scaling up and the fact that $100 million is a drop in the bucket, I think that is spot on. And I think you go in, you know, with the resources that you have, with exactly that in mind, and even like Seki was talking about his example, you know, they've got money, they're looking at the entire city, they're looking at where's the need greatest, and then you say to yourself, how do we use this money so it's going to have the greatest impact, and how do we use our role, even our convening role, so it's going to have the greatest impact. And that's how we often get into the idea of piloting things and really, let's use the flexibility that we have in procurement even to, bring in the right resources, show how to do it so that it can become a model for other cities and others, and sort of then, this whole learning by doing piece that David was talking about, really bringing people around to do some capacity building and training around that. In India, it's a great example. We had $6 million from Gates, and you've got 1 billion people, and you've got 300 million people living in cities, and 25% of any city lives in slums. So it really is a total drop in the bucket. So the way that we got at that scale issue was we worked in 3 cities, and we used each of them as laboratories, but we made for sure that we engaged the state government and the national government, central government, to bring together many more cities to learn from these examples. So, they are evolving their own central government policies on how to promote sustainable, inclusive urbanism, and that's happening at the highest policy level. But our role was to really, show how it can work and demonstrate it, and that's how we try and get sort of practice into policy and play that role. And then just to answer the second question about community engagement, I think that's the challenge of every practitioner wherever you work, and for everyone in this room, that debate comes up. How do we engage the community? And even we made sure that at our meetings in Delhi, when we were bringing many cities together, we made sure that we had residents from the slums involved in these meetings. And it's like, that's why I talked about, you're sort of going up to taboo or breaking the norms, like people saying, why would you include them in this meeting? Well, why not? And that's the sort of little bit of a radical role you can play, because you're not steeped in the cultural norms. You obviously approach it as sensitively and respectfully as possible, but I think that's upon all of us as professionals to try and make it as inclusive as possible.
Could I just,
Sure.
before turning over to Seki, on question 1, there are not only resource constraints from the industrial to the developing world. Within countries, there, and even in this country, there are resource constraints between national, provincial, and local. The local governments aren't getting the money from their own, national governments, just like cities here are kind of given unfunded mandates, which those of you who've worked in cities are familiar with. So it's really about own source revenues in the cities. It's really about revenue generation, a tax structure, land use to maximize your assets with respect to revenue generation. So all of our work on local government capacity building has a focus on revenue generation, because the money's not going to, just magically appear either from international donors or industrial countries, or even your own national or sometimes provincial government. Right. So there really has to be more self-reliance in the cities and a strong, strong focus on own source revenues.
And Seki, did you want to add anything?
Sure. On the first point about sorry, there's a lot of feedback. So can you hear me? Okay. Just on the impact, the first question. I think, like, as Brian and David were saying, we're very, very conscious of this, that it is a drop in the ocean, and that is a serious kind of issue that we need to tackle. Recently, we did this study called Extending Impact, and it was a study across 5 countries that we did, and we wanted to find out what made people take up certain construction techniques to make themselves resilient on their own, having seen our program. So these people weren't part of our program that we were funding, but they were kind of surrounding people surrounding that project. So then, like, through this study, we kind of like identified key things that mobilized them to reconstruct for themselves better. And I think that's the type of way that we're looking into, to say, okay, how can we mobilize the households or the community's assets for themselves, and have a greater impact with the small contributions that we make. So then the way of working might change. You know, it might be more about behavior change modalities rather than constructing for people or replanning a city for that municipality. So I think that area is a new area for our sector. I think it's a little bit more established in the health sector and hygiene sector, where behavior change is quite established. The other one about, I think it's interesting about the trickle-down imperialism. I think from our side, or the NGO side, I hope, or I believe that we're getting better. Like organizations such as us and all the other big NGOs, they work with local partners. We work with the local diocese of the church, if they are in position, and then we go down to the community level. And of course, the process of gaining the funds, gaining access to USAID funds, etc., is a two-way system. And I believe it's kind of like going towards the community side even more in recent years. You know, like a donor says, okay, we could support with this type of programming to this area, and then it comes down to us who consult with the community to say, okay, what type of support is going to assist you more, or what's the most relevant way to support you? And I believe it is getting better. Don't know if Brian and David and Marc would agree, but I think, yeah, an interesting point that you brought up, but I hope we're kind of, dealing with that and getting better and better.
Yeah, question 3, perhaps?
Sure.
I was in Guayaquil in the 70s, and I have not been back. And it was one rough town back then. But I've heard just such marvelous things about Guayaquil now that I just really can't picture it, how pleasant and lovely a place it is. So there must be some great success stories. And I did not know Manila, and I only know today's Manila. But, you know, I think it really comes down to, from a planner's perspective, you know, it's zoning. Where are people really vulnerable? If they're living in a squatter settlement, is it on a riverbank, and are they, you know, susceptible to regular flooding or landslides? Is it really appropriate for human habitation? In which case, I was in a Himalayan town in India where it was actually a socialist mayor, and they were really negotiating with the community about moving, not all of them, but most of them, because they could accommodate a certain population on the hillside, but, and they were negotiating as to where they might move. You know, being close to employment and family is, you know, transportation issues are huge, particularly in Manila, because it could be hours, you know, if you're relocated outside of the metro area. So I think it comes down to planning and zoning, what's appropriate, what's really not appropriate, and when not appropriate, it's really involving the citizens and negotiating and compromising to, you know, relocate in some way, and including subsidies and perhaps paying for, even though they might be squatters, sort of the value of the land if they've been there for quite a while. So I think each case is unique, but it's got to be based on the science and on the planning, and that has to be communicated to the residents. That's the best way I can answer that question. And, you know, the Philippines, as we see today, can be rather heavy-handed. So, you know, there's no dealing with that.
We're out of time.
Yeah.
No, I don't think that-
And with that, thank you all for your time. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Seki, thank you for participating. I know it's about after midnight there, so thank you for staying up late with us, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right.